Hello, everybody. This is Mahadeva, the Thunder Wizard. All right, so I am going to be reading once again from my book Awakening Sleipnir. I read some of it already. That was part one. This, of course, is part two. I don't know if we'll get all the way through it. Yeah, I just wanted to get back on the channel and put something on here. I've been busy doing a lot of stuff. I'm I'm kind of bummed at the moment, although I may not need to be. I just got information on my latest visa. So I've got another 6 months here in Australia, and apparently, even after that 6 months is up, I can still apply for another one. I'll probably get another 3 months out of that because they don't like you to be here continuously for more than 12 months. So if by that end of 9 months from now, if the international borders have opened up and they haven't changed anything, I can probably go back to doing what I was doing. Otherwise, oh God, it makes me so sad. I'll be forced to go back to COVID Central, Los Angeles, California. I really don't want to do that. That would make me very sad. So I'm feeling quite discouraged, even though I may not necessarily need to. But that's where I'm at right now. But I thought I would show up anyway and do something for the channel. So I'm going to continue reading my book, Awakening Sleipnir, Part 2. So let's take a look and see where we are at. So I just finished the chapter entitled, where is it? I just finished reading the chapter entitled Syncretic Shamanism. And now I'm going to start reading the next chapter, which is called Reuniting with My Ancestors, which is on the bottom of page 26 on my PDF. I don't know what it is in the Kindle or whatever version you have. In any case, here we go. So, Reuniting with My Ancestors. After my formal ejection from my Taoist sect, out of frustration and not willing to concede defeat in my quest for continuing my training, I briefly considered looking into Siberian-style shamanism with which I had always felt an affinity. During my initial cursory investigation into what is known as, quote, core shamanism, unquote, I came across a YouTube video by a young man claiming to be of Native American descent, protesting outside of a core shamanism seminar. He was ranting about white people stealing native spiritual knowledge from other cultures. He challenged white people to practice their own spirituality and stop appropriating his ancestral knowledge. Despite the fact that core shamanism is not connected to Native Americans, this video disturbed me deeply. In fact, this video infuriated me. For days, I wandered around the house muttering to myself about that damn ignorant kid and acting out arguments against all of his accusations against New Age white people, until I realized that he was only voicing what I felt inside myself. I was actually not angry with that young Native American. I was angry at myself and my own culture. I admitted that I actually agreed with him on many points. I realized that I was furious at my ancestors who abandoned the old ways. I was furious that my ethnic ancestors had abandoned my ancestral animist traditions. What right did they have abandoning our indigenous shamanic practices? Those were my practices too, and I wanted the right to make my own choice regarding whether or not I wanted to follow them. I was furious and embarrassed that as a result of their choice hundreds of years ago, I was now forced to go to other cultural traditions and beg to be taught animist practices. When I got honest with myself and became aware of the real source of my internal conflict, I went for a walk on a local forested path and proceeded to give my spiritual guides a piece of my mind. Quote, "You guys called me to this path. I did not seek it out. I have done everything you've asked of me, and now you're holding out on me. I give up. If you guys want me to learn this stuff, then you have to bring it to me. I'm done begging for it." Then, exasperated and as a futile gesture of frustration, I said out loud, If there are any ascended masters of my own ethnic heritage that want to teach me their knowledge, I am open to learning from you. The air became very thick and heavy, and I felt a familiar presence of a spirit teacher. But this one felt slightly different than my previous teachers. There was a fiery, exuberant warmth that was in sharp contrast to the stoic stillness of the Taoist guides I had experienced in the past. I became a little frightened. Quote, "Are you sure you want to learn this?" a voice said to me internally. "Are you prepared for what will come and the personal changes you will have to endure? Because once you go down this path, there will be no turning back, and you will be responsible for what you learn. Are you sure you want this?" I was being given a choice. I was being told that I could continue to stay where I was, or I could roll the dice and see where this new path led. There was a real feeling that something fundamental would change within me if I said yes. I had already been through enough spiritual initiations in my life. Did I really want to go through it all over again? Well, of course, I could not say no. As a teacher of esoteric spiritual disciplines, I have learned that it is best to forewarn a student of the power of the initiatory process. This type of initiatory questioning lets the student understand that this is a real path of knowledge that demands respect. And it also lets the student know that this is a path that will fundamentally change them on a psychic and energetic level. This ancestral spirit speaking to me was simply doing what I myself do with my apprentices that come to learn from me, specifically the spirit fighting. I was being given a choice, but I also knew that because I was being given a choice, that this was someone who had something of real depth and power to teach. So really, what choice did I have? How could I resist this opportunity? Of course, I said, yes, please teach me. I've already shared in my first book, The Thunder Wizard Path, much of what transpired after that first encounter with my new ancestral guide. But for those new to this saga, in short, I learned that I was descended from pre-Christian Germanic tribal animists, and I began to receive an ancient pre-Christian shamanic path of knowledge from my European ancestors that spans back at least 50,000 years. Things got very interesting from the very moment I said yes to that spirit. I received multiple visions of ancient Ice Age European shamans wearing antler headdresses, balancing and channeling the powers of nature for their tribe. I had visions of powerful celestial warrior deities who lived in wooden longhouses, decorated with golden shields and spears, illuminated by the warmth of fiery torches. I began to be taught about the real nature of dwarves, elves, valkyries, trolls, and wights, nature spirits. I was taught about the real nature of the ancestral Teutonic Hamingja spirits. I also learned that much of what I had already learned from my African, East Indian, and Chinese teachers was in many ways very similar to what was practiced by my pre-Christian European ancestors. In fact, I was told that I was drawn to those foreign existing animist practices by my ancestors as a means of training to prepare me for my initiation into the animist practices of my genetic Teutonic ancestors. They told me that I was abandoned by my Taoist teachers because I had learned enough from them to lay the foundation to adequately understand and learn my ancestral Teutonic spiritual practices from my ancestral spiritual teachers. I was told that since my recent ancestors had turned away from their ancient animist ways, that there were no longer any living European masters to physically transmit the power of the pre-Christian European animist lineages. I was told that my guides had led me to animist practices from other cultures that still retained an unbroken link to their prehistory in their traditional settings in order for me to experience how power was originally transmitted by the pre-Christian Germanic wizards. I was told I needed to learn the power of initiation and personal transmission of spirit power and apply it to the Teutonic knowledge. I was now receiving. And apply it to the Teutonic knowledge I was now receiving. This is why I continue to repeat the following phrase in my books and videos. Quote, practices with an unbroken connection into prehistory, unquote. Anyone who has practiced any traditional animist practice from a culture with this distinction knows from personal experience what I am talking about. There is a huge difference between intellectually adopting an arbitrary spiritual practice as opposed to receiving the power of an unbroken lineage of animist practitioners. We modern Westerners no longer have a direct, unbroken physical link to our pre-Christian animist traditions. Such a link is necessary in all paths of power unless someone receives that transmission directly from the spirits. While this is possible for spirits to teach directly, in my experience it is very rare. Usually such a transmission must come from a living person. In other words, you can only learn so much from written historical information. One must have power to unlock the mysteries of our mythological lore. If we simply read our ancestral mythology through our modern Western cultural filters that have been tainted with 1,000 years of dualistic monotheism, we will not be able to absorb the power and wisdom of our ancestral animist teachings. While the Teutons are my ethnic ancestors, ethnicity is not the sole focus of this path I am presenting here. I came to find out that I had been in the process of being taught by my ancestral teachers without even realizing it, while training in other cultural disciplines. All shamans who are called to this path of spirit are always shadowed by teachers from their own ethnic ancestry. But I was never told by my guides that any of the knowledge I was learning was, quote, Germanic. I use the terms like Teutonic and Germanic because we humans need these cultural terms to help give context to our traditions. I share my path as one of modern Teutonic animism because our modern Western world has been so badly devastated as a result of being disconnected from our traditional animist ways. I believe it is essential that modern Western culture be able to rediscover the old ways in context of our Western cultural framework so that we can better integrate the knowledge of Earth more deeply into our consciousness. In my opinion, if Westerners continue to see animism as something foreign and exotic, then it may continue to be seen as some optional form of feel-good entertainment that we can choose to take or leave, rather than the necessary, life-saving means of interfacing with our environment that it actually is. Technology is not the ancestral life path of Europeans. Living solely through technology is a very recent experiment even for the Western nations that are primarily responsible for these innovations. Our European ancestors interfaced with reality through the sciences of animism, wizardry, and polytheism for over 50,000 years. We have simply forgotten this fact. As long as we Westerners view animism as something that is only indigenous to other cultures, it may be very difficult for us to reverse the damage we have been unconsciously doing to our planet as a result of our disconnection from Mother Earth. Bringing Westerners back to their ancestral animist roots is my personal agenda, and my guides have allowed me to keep it. But on some level, this has always been the challenge for humans, to integrate spirit knowledge more deeply into our everyday lives as we progress and evolve as a species. Having said all of that, I have come to find out that my ancestral animist teachers do not view their spiritual knowledge through any racial or cultural filter. Many times when I have used the words Teutonic or Germanic while in meditative discourse with them, I can feel my guides' silent confusion as though they had never thought of some of these practices in any kind of cultural framework. The feeling I've gotten multiple times for them has been, quote, what does this spiritual science have to do with being Germanic? That is just the culture you and your ancestors were born into. Culture is not static, it is fluid. What we are teaching you is connected to your ancestral culture, but is also far older and deeper than any of those superficial cultural distinctions. But, sigh, if it makes you feel better, yes, your ancient Germanic tribal ancestors practiced these things too, unquote. From the perspective of my spiritual guides, this sacred knowledge is not limited to any one race or culture. They merely see this knowledge as being part of a direct lineage of spiritual teachings that stretch back millions of years to the very dawn of human beings. To isolate these teachings to the temporal fluctuations of genetic adaptations or race, language, or culture, in their eyes, would be to minimize and desacralize the source of these powerful truths. However, we humans are allowed to gently use these cultural parameters until we are able to regain a sense of self and mature past them to use our knowledge to help unify all people and set the stage for the entire human race to evolve to a higher level of being. All right, so at that point I want to stop and make some comments. Yeah, I feel really strongly about the last part of what I just read. What is important to understand is that any true spiritual knowledge, any true path of power, is a lineage. And what you are connecting to is to ancestral teachers who are also bringing knowledge that goes back on a lineage for thousands of years, all the way back to the first humans. So, it's interesting, we all get caught up with this racial thing. And it has been extremely frustrating, and I put a lot of effort into not even dealing with the nonsense associated with Asatru or any of that other stuff where people somehow got the impression that European knowledge is somehow exclusive to people of a certain skin color. And without getting into that, I get violently angry about it. And so it takes everything in me to hold it back. Because there are some things worth fighting about and some things that are just a waste of energy. But the thing is that, as I've said before, and I've written in all my books, and if you're on my channel, you know it, I don't, the pride that I have for my ancestral practices has nothing to do with the color of my skin. And I am well aware, as I look at the different, splotches of, colors, freckles on my body, that the only reason that my skin is the color it is because my African ancestors 50,000 years ago, by the time they got to Northern Europe, they got locked into an ice age that lasted for 40,000 years. And they interbred with other humans there, which we call Neanderthals, who themselves were descended from Africans, and they had dark skin, and they got to Europe something like 200,000 years before that. So being in Ice Age Europe for 200,000 years, they developed very pale skin and red hair and blue eyes. And that may be where we Europeans get that from. Because we interbred with them, and since we were also in Ice Age conditions, it would have served us to evolve those traits. That's how evolution works, how adaptation works, is we hold on to the traits that help us. So we would have been wanting to, get kids with lighter skin because those were the ones that survived, because they get more vitamin D3. And so that's where all that stuff came from. But it doesn't, it's, like when I listen to racialists talk about this, my first question is, so where did the first white person come from? You see yourself different from Africans and everything else. Where did the first white person come from? And I've never heard a logical response. Some people will say, oh, the white race started in Russia. Like, really? All right. So what happened there? That's not actually what happened, but they want to say that. It's like white people sprouted out of the ground in Europe. When? Why? It doesn't make any sense. It frustrates the fuck out of me when people can't think beyond a tiny little framework. It just, it creates such frustration and rage in me that I can't contain myself. So when there's something like that infuriates me that much, I just don't get into it, because I don't even know where to go. How do you talk to somebody who doesn't even think to themselves the question of, well, let's see, where did the first white person come from? Well, all I know is I'm not them, whoever they are. It's just ridiculous. But obviously we know, because science has told us, and I'm sorry Again, it frustrates the hell out of me that there are so many people attracted to my channel who are uneducated, ignorant, and have all these crazy nutcase, lunatic, closed-minded nonsense things that for some reason think that science is out to get them. It's another one of those things that just frustrates me to no end. But we know from science, we already know, human beings evolved, modern human beings evolved in Southwest Africa about, or probably maybe, I don't know, last I checked, 100,000 years ago. And then there were climatic changes and the human race, the modern human race, almost died out. But it was because of and while our modern human race almost died out, all of the other two-legged hominids, people, human-like, walking around on two legs, they all died out because they didn't have the ability to adapt. And for whatever reason, Homo sapiens had this ability to adapt to different things, and so that's why we survived. And it's the reason why there's overpopulation also. We were so good at surviving almost dying out that now, we can't help but infect the whole world with overpopulation and everything else. It served us really well up until, a couple thousand years ago. So we know that for a fact. So the question is, where did we start? We didn't. Even if people want to read the Voluspa and say that Odin, Vili, and Ve created white people, I mean, when? And what are you going to do with all the other people walking around? Obviously, that doesn't make sense. And so I focus on, because of what I read earlier, I really took to heart that, I still think that kid who said that, was just some new age. He happened to be Native American, but he was entitled and full of himself, and didn't know, he didn't even know the difference between his own tradition and the Mongolian tradition. He didn't even know. All he knew is that white people were doing it, and it looks maybe, I don't even know if he knew what his own tradition was. I honestly don't know. So it's not that I don't think that kid, didn't have some education to learn. It was that what he was saying, I believed and I felt. I was furious that I had to go to other places and sort of beg and plead, can I learn? And always being the foreigner. I didn't like that. It's not so much that I didn't like that. I didn't mind being the foreigner as much as I hated the idea, knowing, I could feel, I knew that this same knowledge was my ancestral heritage as well. I just wasn't allowed to see it because it had been taken from me, however many hundreds or thousands of years ago. And that made me very angry. And so when I started bringing this path back, which was really awakening within me, what felt like a completion for me, when I started working with Thor and Odin, and I started working with runes, and I felt something in my DNA awaken, I was so proud that I wanted to bring that to the world. I didn't know anybody else was doing it. I didn't know that Asatru even existed. I didn't know anything about it. And I started talking about this, and there's other people out there, and I was trying to connect to them, and I found out the majority of them were uneducated racists. They didn't have the first clue about what they were doing. If they did, they had some kind of limited academic understanding. No clue whatsoever that what they were doing was actually connected to other living spiritual traditions on this planet, most notably the Vedic. No clue. And, they climbed up my ass and called me all kinds of horrible names and blah, blah, blah. And if it hadn't been for the fact that I had felt this calling by the spirits I was working with to bring this knowledge to the world, not for any racial reason, but because the world has lost it, has lost this knowledge, and I felt as though I had found a puzzle piece that had been missing, and I was bringing it back so we could put all the pieces of the puzzle together. You know, I have some of those pieces: the Taoist, the Vedic, the Yoruba, West African, you know, bits and pieces I have of that, and now my my personal experience with like the Hool breath and other things, as well as you know, thank the gods that Snorri Sturluson wrote these myths down. Otherwise, we wouldn't know anything. Unfortunately, forgive me for saying so, unfortunately, that's the case with the Druid tradition. It was completely wiped out. And I know a lot of practicing Druids may not like that. I have a lot of respect, and I've talked to people who have done that, and I have respect from what I've heard about some of those recreated traditions, but they don't know. You know, going off of, you know, the Arthurian romances means nothing. We really don't know what the Druids taught. We really don't know what they did. We just don't. And the Germanic tradition was on the path to becoming that, had it not been for Iceland being so far away from the mainland that people kept the myths going, and Snorri Sturluson, you know, wrote them down. Had he not done that, we wouldn't have a clue. So I'm really grateful for that. Anyway, I just wanted to, you know, the point I wanted to make was that this is a path stretching back a long way. We're not going back 1,000 years or 2,000 years. We're going back all the way. And I remember in those early days when, you know, as I'm talking about in this part of the book, I remember being catapulted back into time. And I remember having this feeling of these are your ancestors. And, you know, I remember being in a cave with some firelight going and some chanting I didn't understand going on, and it was really hard to see. And I could see that the shaman was wearing this huge antler headdress. And I also knew they weren't white. Not like I am. And yet those were my ancestors. So, anyway, I'm kind of running out of steam on that. But it's really important for me that we understand this. That you know, the idea, you know, I talk about it in my other book, Shamanism for White People. White is in quotes, by the way. That, you know, just arbitrarily trying to pretend to be Native Americans is not just demeaning to them, it's demeaning to us, because it means we hate ourselves. And we can be who we are. And we still have this connection, if we choose to. The runes are I'm so grateful that the runes are still around, because they are a means to connect. I teach what little I know, and I mean that. I know almost nothing about the runes. I don't claim to be a rune expert, and yet, in my opinion, I think I know more about what the runes mean than the majority of the, you know, the Asatru academics out there who think they know what the hell they're talking about. And yet, I can honestly say I don't feel like I know anything about the runes. Other than when I chant them according to the method that I teach, which if you haven't done that, you know, you can get that in the book, The Thunder Wizard Path. I teach you how to do that. And I teach you on some videos on this channel as well. But when you can do that original silent breath technique with the runes, I can't think of anything more powerful in my experience. All right, anyway, I'm starting to babble. Let's keep reading. First, let me just check and see if anybody's even watching. It's okay if nobody is, because it's in the middle of the night everywhere. This says we've got 11 people on there. And people throwing around comments and what have you. I will see if I'll do a question and answer. And somebody is, this is probably not a good day to feed the beast. And if somebody writes down something that I don't find to be very enlightened, I'm going to really destroy it today. But I'm not ready to do that just yet. Let's keep reading. So now we're into the section of the book called Section 2, Reclaiming Our Past. So, next chapter. My vision for this path. My path, which I call modern Teutonic animism, I don't call it that anymore. I just call it the Thunder Wizard path. This was a long time ago, and I didn't want to. I was still wrapped up in, what do I call it? And I was really aware that I was tapping into something of my ethnic heritage, and so I felt I needed to give it a name. I don't call it this anymore, but you're free to call it whatever you want. In any case, I said, my path, which I call modern Teutonic animism, has been created primarily from these personal mystical experiences and syncretized with my personal training. However, I have also done extensive research to corroborate my experiences. I have not sought the approval of academics or self-appointed neo-pagan or neo-heathen religious authorities. That is not how animism works. I have great respect for academicians, and I respect those who seek to accurately reconstruct their ancestral religions by means of scholarly works. I use many of the works of the academicians in my research. However, I understand that academics are human and they are prone to make inaccurate conclusions based on their own limitations, modern biases, personal agendas, and inaccurate assumptions. As a wizard, it is my responsibility to corroborate all my personal spiritual experiences with external reality. In the beginning of my Teutonic initiation, I made a conscious effort to take all of my meditative visions and experiences with a grain of salt, assuming that they were probably just my own imaginary projections. I have not made public any of my spiritually derived teachings without having corroborated them with historical and linguistic evidence or by comparison to existing animist traditions that have an unbroken connection into prehistory. Even though in the beginning I tended to doubt the majority of my intuitions and experiences, as I have continued to seek corroboration for them, I have found more and more evidence in historical and linguistic data that I am not merely imagining this stuff. Chinks in the armor of academia. However, as I make use of academic sources and scholarly opinions, I have also found that many academic scholars have missed a lot of obvious clues about our ancestors' religion. Most of these clues are blatantly obvious to anyone who has personal experience in any traditional mystical practice that has an unbroken link to prehistory. One example of this is regarding the extinction of the pre-Christian Germanic word for the god of sacred fire. It is well known in academic linguistic circles that the Indo-European languages originally had two words for fire. One word referred to a living internal spiritual fire, and a second word referred to an inert external physical fire. Latin retains the Indo-European root for the living fire in the word ignis, from which we get the word ignite. The Vedics still use the word Agni to denote this ancient Indo-European fire deity. The pre-Christian Germanic tribes also used this same word for the living fire with a slightly different pronunciation of ing. They simply transposed the N and the G letters. Now that part is not accurate. Actually, after having done research into the Proto-Indo-European version of the word, that word was something like ink. It was in fact the Vedics and the Greeks and the Romans who inverted the G and the N sound. So the Germanics actually hold on to the original sound of the ironic thing is they held on to the original pronunciation of the god of internal fire, and yet they forgot it. It's not in our language anymore. In fact, the power of Ing, back to the text now. In fact, the power of Ing was so sacred to the Teutonic tribes that the runic Ing symbol and sound is one of the original sacred root sounds that would pass down in Germanic sacred talismanic magic known today as the runes. I'm going to look for Ing for you right now. So this symbol. Let me see if I can. All right. The modern English language only retains the physical aspect known as fire. The use of the word Ing has fallen out of use in modern English as a result of the desacralization of the natural world in post-Christian modern Western culture. Possibly the last English word to retain this Indo-European root word for the living fire is found in the word Inglenook, the nook of the fire god Ing. An Inglenook is simply an older word for the hearth, the fireplace of the home. The Inglenook reflects the ancient tribal Germanic practice of keeping a sacred fire altar within the dwelling of each family. Besides being the place where the home was heated and food was cooked, the Inglenook was also a place where the family gathered for rituals and to share stories. There's a reason why Christmas stockings are still hung over the mantles of our fireplace. It is because we still retain an instinctual understanding that the fireplace is a holy altar. Sadly, however, this word Inglenook is almost completely unknown to modern English speakers and has effectively become extinct. Anyone who has practiced Vedic mysticism and also studied the runes can easily see that Agni and Ignis and Ing are slightly different pronunciations for the very same Indo-European deity of the sacred sacrificial fire, whose smoke carries the scent of the sacrifice to the gods. This linguistic connection is ridiculously obvious to me, yet I have yet to read one Indo-European or Proto-Germanic linguistic scholar or even rune divination expert, quote, unquote, who has made this very obvious connection between Ignis, Agni, and Ing. Another example of modern academic failure to see our ancient linguistic connections to our spiritual practice is the linguistic connection between the names of the Vedic thunder god Indra and the Teutonic god Thunor. As you will read later on in this book concerning the linguistic, actually it's not this book, it's the one after. I wrote this book thinking I was writing one book and it turned into two. So the first one I called Awakening Sleipnir and the second one I called Mounting Sleipnir. And it's in Mounting Sleipnir where I talk about the Vedic and the Germanic deities and their names and how they are connected. Anyway, as you will read later on in the next book concerning the linguistic and mythical connection between these two deities, unless one has intimate knowledge of esoteric Vedic mantric sciences, it is very unlikely that the average academic who has little personal experience in such disciplines will make the correct linguistic connection between these two Indo-European thunder deities. In fact, even most Vedic mystics and scholars do not even know the ancient roots of their mantric root words. That is how very, very old these magical Indo-European root words really are. And that's actually true. If you try and read, what are seed sounds, what are bija mantras, you will read somebody at some point, some Indian Vedic scholar will say, these are nonsense power syllables that have no meaning, but they have power. And that is just absolutely false. For instance, the word, the sacred mantra Om, which is actually pronounced O-N-G, Om. That, before that was like the Vedic mantra. Before that, it was the mantra Ing, I-N-G. That was the mantra. And that happened to be the seed sound for Indra. But Ing, as it turns out, if you read, and do I have the book around here somewhere? I somewhere packed away, I have the book of where the guy talks about how Ing, I-N-G, was the original Vedic mantra and that it was the mantra of Shakti. It was the mantra of Kundalini. And so there's also no mistaking that it's also the root word for Indra, because Indra is the lightning god. But Ing, if you notice, Ing or excuse me, not Ing, but Frey, whose name is also Ingunar, which means Lord of Ing. You always see him seated in yogic position in meditation with a fully erect phallus. It means that he has controlled and fully awakened his kundalini and his sexual power. So that's why he is Lord of Ing. Anyway, there's no way that you would be able to put all these things together if you're just an academic who's only stuck in Western academia. And even the Vedics don't have forgotten the connection with their European cousins. And so that gives you an idea of how long this lineage has been around. It's been around longer than human beings have been in the Northern Hemisphere. Because it wasn't like, there was some guy, in Scandinavia who went down over into India, 7,000 years ago, and they worked things out. No, it means that 50,000 years ago, they were doing and talking and had these roots, and then they split and went into all different places. And then because of ice ages and things like that, their whole ethnicities changed. And yet we held on to this same root knowledge, the same language. Even though I'm speaking English, English and Sanskrit are simply two dialects of the same Indo-European language. Of course, they're unintelligible now, but they're the same language. And eventually you run into words that are the same. All right. So now back to the book here. The reason I bring this up is not to demean academic scholars. I rely heavily on academic linguistic and historical sources to reconstruct my version of Teutonic animism. But I also know that academics can make mistakes too. If an academic conclusion does not seem to jibe with the objective evidence, I will reject it. This is an important point, in my opinion, because much of modern neo-heathen, neo-pagan reconstructionist dogma and practice is derived exclusively from current Western academic conclusions. In fact, if there was one sacred cow in the neo-pagan, neo-heathen universe, it would be the worship of academia. While I understand my neo-heathen brethren's desire to accurately recreate the spiritual traditions of our Germanic ancestors, I disagree with many of the conclusions that are commonly held to as fact by many pagans and heathens today. So don't be surprised if I share conclusions and opinions that are not politically correct among some of my more conservative neo-heathen and neo-pagan brethren. I'm making a lot of reference in this book because this was early on, and I was still, reeling from having tried to connect with other people and having, gotten a really bad taste in my mouth for number one, because the majority of them in the Germanic circle had some kind of racialist tint to them. But I also found them to be so incredibly opinionated and uneducated. And also, they were going off of academia. And who's the guy? Stephen Flowers. I forget, goes by another name. You know who I'm talking about. He's got a lot of really interesting stuff. This is a guy who went to college and got his master's or PhD or something. And he learned a lot of really good stuff. But he also was a Western magician, which, as you know, I don't see Western magic as being part of the tradition that goes back into prehistory. It's something that was cobbled together long after our Germanic and even our Celtic traditions were wiped out. And so people used what they had. They had this, and people still do it today. It's really, really popular in New Age culture. So many people, I'm into what do they call that? I'm into Egyptian this, and I'm into Egyptian that, and all they're doing is, there was a time when it was vogue to try and go back to the original thing, and so people went back to Egypt, and they started trying to put together Egyptian this and Egyptian that. And, but they did the same thing. The only things they had available to them were biblical stuff. So that's why there are people who talk about working with, all of the Hebrew named, angels and all that stuff. I can't I can't connect to that stuff because it feels artificial, and it doesn't feel it connects me to something that goes back into prehistory. So that's the feeling I get when back then when I was trying to find some connection with an existing, Germanic polytheist tradition, and I kept on running into these neo-pagans and neo-heathens. And I even, I can't stand the word pagan and heathen. It just amazes me that people use those words, because pagan literally means like stupid idiot person who lives in the middle of nowhere. It means redneck. That's the word that the upper class in Rome, when they became Christians, they would talk about the stupid pagans because they hadn't converted to Christianity yet. Same thing with heathen. A heathen is somebody who lives out on the heath. What is the heath? Out in the bush, in the middle of nowhere. Those heathens, they haven't accepted Jesus yet. So why they carry those names around, I don't know. So, back to the book. So don't be surprised if I share conclusions and opinions that are not politically correct among some of my more conservative neo-heathen and neo-pagan brethren. I believe that if we truly want to recreate an authentic form of pre-Christian Germanic polytheism, we need to compare our existing knowledge of Teutonic polytheism with the only surviving form of Indo-European polytheism that has an unbroken connection to its prehistory. That, of course, is Vedic polytheism and its direct descendant, Hindu polytheism. As you will see in this book, I have found some, later in the next book, as you will see in the next book, I have found some extremely strong connections between the ancient Teutonic polytheist and the Vedic polytheist religion. When I first started my research, I expected some distant similarities between these two Indo-European religions, but as you will see, our Germanic ancestors were very closely related to the Vedics. In fact, in my opinion, the Germanic tribes were more closely related, at least linguistically, to the Vedics than to their nearer neighbors, the Celts, Romans, and Greeks. So it only makes sense to utilize the vast information contained in the Vedic religion as a resource for recreating the pre-Christian Teutonic religion. I didn't write it in this book because I didn't want to put the time in it, but I want to share something about the Celts and what I gleaned about the Celts. Now, because my last name sounds Celtic, Denney, up until this happened, I thought I was Celtic. I thought I was Welsh or Irish. And my dad would say that we were Welsh, and then he would say, but the reason that I think that is because, and this was his mom back in the 20s. If you remember, back in the 20s, in the late 1800s, Irish were like the refugees that everybody hated. There was a big racial, they were really prejudiced against Irish people. That's why Irish people, you always see Irish people as cops, right? Because that's the only job they could get, because they were just these, they had to get some jobs, so they all became cops. So I thought I was Irish or Celtic, my dad, or Welsh, and my dad said, my mom told us we were Welsh, but I think she said that because she didn't want people to think we were Irish. So I thought I was Irish this whole time. And Denney sounds Irish. It's got that Irish sounding EY on the end of it. So I just assumed that's what I was. And then long before all of this, I did some shamanic journeying. And I did some shamanic journeying to go and meet with the Celtic gods. And I knew of them and had studied them, and I thought that was my ancestry. I tried reading whatever mythological stuff I could get my hands on, and it just didn't connect with me. I didn't understand any of it. And then I did this shamanic journey to them, and they all showed up, and they all looked at me like, what the hell are you doing here? It was just kind of like, they were just sort of like this, like, why are you here? And I remember getting some gifts from them, but there was just no connection, and I just let that go. I just didn't feel a connection, and then I got really into Taoist stuff and other things, and I forgot about it. And it wasn't until around this time that I, in meditation, they were telling me I was uh, from northern Germany, from that part of where Scandinavia and northern Germany line up on the west coast of Europe. There, that's where I was from. That's where my ancestors were from. I didn't want to hear that. I didn't like that idea at all. And then I started reading the Norse myths, and boom, all of my DNA started coming alive inside of me. And then did some more research on my last name and found out that nope, Denney means Danish. It means Danish Viking. So anyway, why did I say all that? I can't remember now. I think I had a point, but I forgot what it was. It's getting late for me. All right, so in this book, which I really mean the next book, I will share my research and provide you with information about my sources for my conclusions, but I will do so in a narrative fashion rather than an academic fashion. You will not find copious footnotes or bibliographies in this book. If that is important to you, my apologies, but I'm not seeking to write a history paper, nor am I writing a college term paper. All right, so now I remember why I was saying that. So I was bumping into all of the neo-heathens who were just driving me crazy and pissing me off, and they were coming at me really hard in all kinds of ways. And, they were quoting, for everything that they did. On the one hand, they would say, we don't have a Bible, which is true, because there's no such, because they're obviously responding to the Christian, the Word of God. We don't have a Word of God. But at the same time, they would worship academics. And so for everything that they said about any of the gods or whatever, they would quote some academic. And I got nothing against that, except that there isn't an academic I've read. I haven't read one academic who has said we need to study the runes if we want to understand the Germanic people's language and culture. We need to understand that. That is like a living tradition that's held over from pre-Christian times. But the reason they don't do that is because academics have an unconscious connection to the Christian church, which is modern academia comes from. Academics were priests. If you wanted to learn something, wanted to learn right, you wanted to learn history, you had to become a priest. And then that, all of our colleges in Europe and even the first in the United States all had some hardcore Christian, thing attached to it. And so even though now academia is totally, not religious, it still has this bias towards anything spiritual or anything superstitious. So you don't ever see an academic talk about the runes. And if you do, they make this unsubstantiated assumption, which is completely, totally without any historical merit or proof whatsoever, that the runes were brought back by Germanic mercenaries who came back home from fighting for Rome or Greece or whomever, and came back with an alphabet. And it's taught as fact. They just put it out there as fact. But there's nothing to prove that. There's nothing to back that up. It's pure conjecture. This is why, if I am educated, I believe very strongly in education, but I also believe in being smart about what you're reading and what people tell you. Anyway. So I'm writing all of this because I was about to start talking about this connection between the Vedics and the Germanics, and I was getting myself ready for the criticism, which I was sure was going to come, which did come a little bit in the very beginning. Modern intellectual, pseudo pagan intellectuals would come at me and try and throw all kinds of academic crap at me saying I didn't know what I was talking about. Or they would quote some other academic from like 17 or 1800 who had no clue what they were talking about. So I was getting ready for that. That's why I'm doing all of this posturing here and telling you why I'm not writing footnotes and why I'm not doing this, because I was getting ready for a lot of criticism that never really showed up. At least not to me. If they're talking about it, they're doing it behind my back. All right. I highly encourage, back to the book now, I highly encourage any reader to follow up on my conclusions with their own research. Besides, I have found that oftentimes if there are lengthy bibliographies and copious footnotes in a book, that the reader can be lulled into a false sense of security and will simply believe whatever is presented to them. So if you think my research is off, do your own research and come up with your own conclusions. We will all be better educated for it. My main purpose in writing this book is to help facilitate modern Westerners in reestablishing a direct, visceral, animist connection to the gods and ascended masters of their ancestry. I do not expect my approach to work with everyone, but I believe that there are others out there who, like me, will benefit from this information. My goal is to help as many Westerners as possible to reestablish a living spiritual connection to the gods and ascended masters of their ancestors, so that we may heal ourselves from centuries of self-imposed spiritual exile from our ancestral traditions. Lastly, I feel this needs to be said once again. Anyone of any race, ethnicity, religion, or cultural background is completely welcome to practice modern Teutonic animism. My teachers and spiritual guides have made it very clear that spiritual power cannot be exclusively owned by anyone for any reason. You are all welcome here. All right. Section 2, Teutonic shamanism. Boy, I didn't really pay a lot of attention when I edited this, did I? All right. How long is this? Long 42. It's a long book. All right. So yeah, there's a lot more left. I'm not going to get through. I'm just going to leave it here for now. We'll get into some other cool stuff later. But where am I going? Where was that? Page 42? Is that where I said? At least in my PDF, page 42. Yeah, all right, so I'm going to leave it there for now. So this is the end of part 2 of me reading my book, Awakening Sleipnir. I'll check and see if there are any questions or any stupid comments that I need to devalue and berate. I'm just refreshing the page here. Give me a second. Got a whopping 10 people here in the middle of the night. So Yoki Better, you're probably not even watching. If you are, please write the word question so I don't miss it. And again, let me just say, you guys are better off asking me questions about stuff I teach. I know people just come on here and they just sort of have questions and they want to throw them around. This looks like one of them. What is my opinion on tattoos? I don't really have an opinion on them. Can it harm you, and is there such a thing as a spiritual tattoo? I don't have tattoos, and I don't have them primarily because I was going to put them, I would be covered in them. But I was an actor in my 20s, and back then it was bad to have tattoos because you needed to not, you needed to be able to, look right for any part, and tattoos limited you. So I didn't tattoo myself. And then later, most recently, my ex-wife didn't like tattoos, so I didn't have any. And then my fiance, who passed away, also didn't like tattoos, so I didn't have any. And now at this age, I'm wondering if I put out tattoos, because I think about it all the time. If I put tattoos on my body, I look okay now, but what am I going to look like in 10 years? What am I going to look like in 20 years? When you're 30, it's okay. When you're 56, I don't know. So I haven't, and also because it's just, people, it's just such the fad now, and everybody tattoos themselves. And I think, it just, lots of times tattoos just look like dark splotches of bleh. I want to be able to see something. You're going to put some art on your body, I want to be able to see it. And these big giant things in the black and it's just like, it looks ugly to me. A well-placed tattoo in one spot here or there can look really cool. Like I said, I still haven't decided if I'm going to do it. Can it harm you? Yes, it can harm you. You can get infected. It can, do bad things for you. I heard somebody say who was, I think, worked in Chinese medicine, says it's scarring you and it messes up your chi and all that. So is there such a thing as a spiritual tattoo? I suppose. But I think that 99% of people's tattoos are just for, ego and looks, which I have nothing against that. I just don't think it's very spiritual. I mean, what are they going to do with some of these things in 10 or 20 years? They look really hot now. Like I'm seeing it here. It's probably the same everywhere. But younger women, are tattooing themselves like crazy. I guess young men are too. I just look at women more than I do men. And it looks cool now, but I think, what are you going to do, in 20 years when you got kids? Is that really how you're going to want to look? Anyway, I'm sounding like an old fart now, but who cares? All right, so I don't really have an answer for you. Gary Rosenquist, if you have a question, please write the word question. Why are so many humans asleep? That's not really a question. You're just kind of telling us how spiritual you are. I feel so alone and frustrated that I volunteered to be here and I can't remember why. So Gary, you're new to my channel. I strongly recommend that you go onto my channel and watch my videos about reincarnation. Because you said you're right. You're frustrated that you volunteered to be here and can't remember why. Well, it doesn't matter. You're not following your joy. So read this book or watch the videos. I read this book out loud on this channel, so you can go back and, if you don't want to buy the book, you can listen to it. The Shamanic Secret Command meant to a perfect life. Go and read that. You don't have to worry. You don't have to worry about not remembering. You just have to focus on why you're here. And if you don't know why you're here, then you'll ask those kinds of questions. I'm frustrated. I can't remember why I'm here. Well, you came here to achieve something, so read that book and figure it out. Alex Tremel del Norte says, according to the racialist perspective, the white race was created by the gods. You didn't answer. I mean, I know that you're just repeating what they said, but listen to that. It doesn't mean anything. I asked a very specific question, which is, where did it come from? So I know that you're not representing this opinion, but let's both look at it and think how incredibly stupid it is. So what you're saying is, what they say is that we have all these other humans walking around who are created by who knows what, but for some reason the gods created white people, and these white people for some reason are able to interbreed with all these other people who were created by who knows what. It's a bunch of horseshit. Human beings were created by the gods. And anybody who thinks that is an absolute, they're as idiotic as the flat earthers. To not understand that all human beings originally came from somewhere else, from someone else, that everything is shifting and changing all the time. We have different physical features than our original, modern humans did. They had, it's just, I just get so furious. I get so furious. I just want to crack skulls. It makes me so angry. Stupidity. This doesn't make people smart, though. That's my lesson in this life. I can't beat smart stuff into people. I've had to take a vow of nonviolence. But that kind of stuff just really infuriates me. And, the fact that you know that. I mean, do you know that because you heard it? Were you once part of that? Why? Why would somebody do that? Why? To be a racist, there's you either got some kind of mental defect or you're just the most frightened pussy that's ever walked the planet. And then Alex says, don't forget to like and subscribe. I agree, sir. Please. Yeah. So yeah, you're using the ash and embla, but they're saying the gods, it doesn't say that. The myth of Odin, Vili, and Ve breathing life into the ash and the elm. At no point in that does it say, and only in this area of northwestern Europe that Odin came down and breathed life, and this doesn't say that. It means the first people. It's really clear. That myth is very clear. It's not white people. It's the first humans. Very clear. God, that annoys the crap out of me. That's not your fault, Alex. That's just the way they are. Alex asks, do you think there's a connection between the fact that ing is a bija mantra of Shakti and the fact that the ing suffix is used to denote an action taking place as one speaks? Everybody asks that question, and I don't have an answer. I think it's a coincidence, because the ing in English is ante in Latin. So I don't think it's the ing rune. However, it is an interesting correlation. Edward Thorson, yeah, that's the other guy. Stephen Flowers and Edward Thorson. You know, I really liked a lot of his stuff until I started reading some of his magical works, and I found that he just basically ripped off. I mean, I can't speak for all of it. A lot of what I saw, he took from modern Western magic and just kind of slapped it on top of, you know, rune magic, and acted as though he wasn't doing it and said, this is what it is. And, you know, I try and be very clear. If I'm doing something, if I'm syncretizing something, I try and let you know exactly where it's coming from and why I'm doing it, and I own that I'm syncretizing it. You know, even if I think like the Hool breath, that is my belief that came from Mother Hulda. I think it was used, you know, like 30,000 years ago in Europe, but there's no way for me to prove that. So I'm happy to own it and say I created it. But that's my belief. That's the mythology I put around it, but I'm not trying to pretend it's anything other than that. I tell you guys where it came from. He did a lot of things without explaining why, and he just threw it out there as fact, and I didn't like that. And he clearly had an academic bias and threw a lot of modern Western academic biases on the stuff that he wrote. So, and plus I tried to be a part of his rune guild, and I ran into such idiots there. And I think that they broke that one down and then put up a new one. And then I tried to get in that one, and they said something about, you know, it just became so weird. Anyway, Self-Elevation has some thoughts about what I think is nonsense Egyptian New Age stuff. Ancient Typhonian Egypt. I don't know what that means. What is Typhonian? Is where a lot of all these concepts and teachings come from. That's actual fact and history. Post-dynastic Egyptian stuff is used for New Age shit. Feel me? I don't know what you're trying to say. But anyway, I don't know anything about it. I just know, you know, that kind of stuff was going on in, you know, the Hellenic era. You know, just around the pre-Christian era. A lot of that stuff was going on. A lot of the Romans and Greeks did that. But, you know, it's like people in America trying to go after Native American shamanism. It doesn't mean that it was actually going back, you know, thousands of years to the original Egyptian. Now, I could be wrong. That's just the feeling I get from it, and I know that they did that. You know, that's you know, there's a guy that comes onto YouTube, you know, with an ad. I don't know if it still comes on, but I used to hear it all the time. The guy sounds like Elmer Fudd, and he's talking about you know, symbols, you know, and he talks about the United States using, you know, Egyptian symbols. Who are these people and what were they trying to do? He makes me laugh every time I hear that guy. But it was just vogue to do that. It didn't mean anything, you know. And people want to talk about the, you know, the Illuminati as being like this ancient, you know, and the Masonics being ancient Egyptian. They were just picking from stuff that looked cool and had some air about it. They didn't know anything about the ancient Egyptians. They were just trying to look cool. You know, it was the vogue thing to do. Anyway, so let's see what else. Dravidian science comes from ancient Typhonian Egyptian science. That's the truth. Well, man, you gotta give me more than that. Self-elevation. I believe, you know, you've always been very respectful on my channel, but you can't throw that out as fact. I mean, that saying it's a fact doesn't mean a lot. You know, I'm going to be straight with you. You brought up some stuff that I hadn't heard of before, that I went and I researched, and I was really shocked that you had brought that in here. I mean, I found it to be really racist from the opposite side. I found it really racist and really, coming from left field with no historical any background. That really kind of shocked me. So I'm taking this with a grain of salt. So I'm going to now that you've put this on here, I'm going to look for Typhonian Egyptian science. And I'm going to see if I agree with you or not. But anyways, I do appreciate your connection to the channel here. All right, so let's see. Any more questions here? Where was I going? Alex Tremo del Norte, question, is urban life better than rural life? I don't know. Come on, man. What am I supposed to do with that? Ask me a question about something I teach. I could care less. If you want to live in the city, live in the city. If I like living right here where I'm not in the city, but I'm not in the middle of the woods. I can go and, but there's rainforest all around me that I can go and hike through. I like that. You can like whatever you want. Okay, so this isn't a question, but I am going to respond to it. Alex says, I think Stephen Flowers, Thomas Carlson, I don't even know who that is, and others do consider necessary to understand the runes in order to fully understand spiritual Germanic culture. Yeah, I understand that too, but I don't see them looking into our neighbors, our cousins, the Vedics. I don't see them even trying or wanting to look into it. So saying that it's necessary to understand the runes in order to fully understand spiritual Germanic culture doesn't really mean anything. Because we can both say that and be on completely different sides of everything. You know what I mean? So my beef with those guys isn't really a huge beef. It's just I found that for me, their knowledge was very limited. And it was not, for me, it was not very intuitive. I think they were stuck and limited in, how they thought about things. And I heard a lot of assumptions that were basically just rehashed, academic assumptions. So anyway, let's see what else. Alex, why do you want to further comment on the racialist view? What is there to comment about? I'm so glad I'm not in the US right now. That would be really, really stressful for me. But you know what? When I was born in Los Angeles. I think the year that the Watts riots happened, so I was too young to understand what was going on there. Obviously, I was an infant. And then I was in Hollywood. I had a theater in Hollywood when the Rodney King riots broke out. And that was scary. I had to pick my way back, I had to pick my way back through fires and trash cans burning and streets blocked off. And I had to drive back from Hollywood back to West LA and then, spend a week watching the fires, coming closer and closer and people trying to get out of town. And I thought, you know what, we've figured it out now, because I remember as a kid, the cops in South Bay, the Lomita sheriffs. As a white kid, you didn't want to get pulled over by the white cops in Lomita because they'd beat the crap out of you and throw you in jail for no reason. So I have no doubts of all the stuff that you hear about cops because I've seen it. I know for a fact that stuff happens. But I thought after Rodney King, we got it all figured out. Now we can start healing and moving. And so to see us back there again, and to see in some cases we've gone backwards, really affects me. I'm holding back some emotion. I was trying to think about the upcoming elections in the U.S. and I just kind of got tired. I lost all hope. It's just, what the hell, man? But this has been going on a long time. the most recent stuff, and I think maybe I'd like to believe maybe we can start moving forward in our race relations. It's really saddening, you know. I remember the 60s and 70s. In fact, I was flipping through a bunch of YouTube videos, you know, old rock and roll songs where you saw like, you know, multi-ethnic people. You know, it was like the thing. You had like people of different races and cultures in rock bands in the 70s, and we were all about that. And I thought for sure, you know, we were going to put an end to all this crap. It just frustrates me to see that, and I get so infuriated. You know, these guys, we're mentioning two of these guys. I don't know what's going on now, but, you know, Edred Thorson, I know that he was sort of on, you know, in the Asatru part of the movement towards being more understandable and opening up and not being racially exclusive. And then for some reason he flipped. And I just don't understand that. Maybe I don't know the whole story, but it's just so infuriating to me when people take the spirituality of my ancestors and connect it to that garbage. It makes me so angry. So I'm really glad I'm not in the U.S. right now. It would be really, really painful for me to watch that. Okay, somebody has this really strange name. It's kind of funny, but I'm not going to repeat it. And he asks, from a newbie, so is Earth alive and female? Is her name Gaia? One of her names is Gaia, and yes, she is alive and female. There you go. What else here? Alex Tremel del Norte says Typhon is more or less the Greek form of Jormungandr. So you're saying it's Greek, the Typhonic Egyptian is Greek Egyptian? That's kind of what I thought. It was sort of like there was this new age. It's kind of like the equivalent of New Age, but it was Greek New Age. You know, they were trying to pretend to be, you know, Egyptian when they really weren't. Yeah. Everybody wanted to be Egyptian. I mean, you know, the Greeks went down there. What is his name? Alexander the Great went down and conquered Alexandria, and then that became, the Greek. It became Greek, you know, and so these Greeks were down there pretending to be Africans. Man, it was anyway. This shit's been going on forever. Alex Tremor, I asked about rural life because you mentioned living in the bush was sometimes negative, or at least that's what I understood. I don't know that I mentioned living in the bush was negative. Whenever it was, 2 or 3 months ago, when I was living 300 miles south of here, I was living in an area that was energetically not good for me. It was crazy, wild, you know, like jungly Australian forest stuff with like bats the size of German shepherds, literally. And all kinds of other stuff. And it was really powerful stuff, but I wasn't comfortable there. The energy wasn't good for me. So I don't think I've ever said that. I've lived in wilderness a lot of my life. You know, I've lived in forest and wilderness a lot. I love it. Just there's something about that place. What it was about that place is it was a floodplain. So I was surrounded by swamps. So there was a lot of yin energy. And so it was basically you're like kind of floating on the water. There was some other traditional stuff that I didn't know about, which you gotta be careful of. If you don't know what the, you know, indigenous connection is and what they were doing in that place, you don't know what kind of energy you're walking into, especially if you don't know anything about it. So might have been some connection there, you know, because the land holds on to the spirits of, who's ever been there, you know. So if just because somebody, you know, puts a city on top of what used to be some indigenous sacred ground, that's not going to take away the power that's been put in there on this continent. You know, these are the closest thing to the first humans we can find. You know, these guys have been here for 50,000 years. So when you look at an Aboriginal, which, an indigenous Australian, you're looking at the first humans. Those are our ancestors. And I could tell you stories about the things I'm hearing about how they're being treated here, which is really awful, but I'm not going to get into that. What else? Question: what would be the ethical explanation for why racism is wrong? What do you mean? Why do you even have to ask that question? Come on, man. The ethical explanation? What do you mean? I don't even know how to answer that. It's not obvious. I mean, when somebody's mean to me, it hurts my feelings. I don't like it. When somebody takes away your rights and your abilities for some ridiculous external detail, what are you talking about? Why do I need to make an ethical explanation for it? Would you like people treating you that way? Is that it? That's all. I don't understand. I don't get it. I don't get why. Anybody who's watching this, if you haven't, go watch. I have some videos on here about racism. And I talk about why, if you want to know why white people are racist, I'll tell you. It's because we forgot. We are carrying around a 2,000-year-old racial wound that happened to Northern Europeans 2,000 years ago. And the thing is, if you don't become conscious of what you're carrying around with you, you spread it to other people. And when you find out what happened to the Gothic people, the fall of Rome. The fall of Rome, go watch my videos about that. The fall of Rome was simply because there were Mongolians who were invading northwestern Europe. So a lot of Germanic tribal people were getting hammered on both sides. The Romans were hammering them from the south, and were having a hard time getting past the really dense, thick forests of what used to be in Germany. It was a jungle. They couldn't get past that. But then what was coming is then the Mongolian tribes were coming in from the east. And they came in, and so these guys were getting hammered on both sides, and they weren't used to fighting the way that the Mongolians fought. The Mongolians fought guerrilla-style warfare, where they came in on horseback, shooting arrows at you from their horse. They didn't get off their horse. The Germanics, your typical dumb white guy in a bar, stands face to face and looks at you and calls you a bunch of names and blah, 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 and the pushing and shoving, and then comes the throwing of fists. That's how they fought. That was part of their pride, was to stand directly in front of your opponent. So you if you were going to fight somebody, you went and you stood, on the empty field in front of each other. Mongolians didn't fight like that. They'd just come in on horseback and just... The word parting shot comes from, as they're riding away, backwards, they're shooting at you from behind. It's called a parting shot. That's where we get that term. So they couldn't handle that. They weren't trained for that. And so they came in, and just like we're seeing now in the United States, exactly like we're seeing now. All these refugees piled up onto the border of the Roman Empire, asking to be let in. And understand, there was a racial divide back then. Romans back then, before the fall of Rome, were not all, like you see now. You see a lot of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Roman people. Lombardy, right? Lombardy is actually Langobard. It's a Germanic word. It means long beard. That's the fall of Rome. Those are the guys who took over Rome. But what ended up happening is you had all these blonde-haired, blue-eyed people who looked different, and there was a racial and ethnic and a linguistic divide between the civilized Romans and these barbarian white people, who at that time were seen as the most primitive people on the planet. And so they were all piled up against the Roman border wanting to get in. And they're saying, we just want to be part of the Roman Empire. We want to get away from these guys that, took our land away from us and are killing us. And so the Romans put them into giant concentration camps. Huge. There's a reason why the Nazis did what they did. It's because it was an unconscious genetic memory of what happened to their distant ancestors. They had no conscious awareness of why they were doing it. It was genetic and it was deep within their conscious memory. And so you had all of these blonde-haired, blue-eyed people who are shoved into these concentration camps, and they were told, just wait here. We'll figure it out. Just wait here and we'll process you. And then they took all the men of fighting age and put them in the Roman army and put them as human shields, put them at the front of the Roman army, and then had them go back up north to fight their cousins. And these guys learned how to fight because they were in the front row. The ones that survived learned how to be badass fighters. They figured out all the Roman ways of fighting, and they became really hardcore badass, Roman style fighters. These guys came back and saw their grandmothers and their mothers and their children in this wallow in this filth. And what was going on is that the Roman soldiers who were guarding these people in these huge concentration camps, they were supposed to be giving them food, like Rome is sending them food and supplies, and they're supposed to be giving them the food. Instead, they're selling it to them. And they would take people's children in exchange for food. At one point, it got so bad that they were selling dog meat to these people in exchange for their children to go into slavery. And it was better to have their kids go into slavery because at least they'd have some place to live and food to eat. Do you understand why Western Europe did what it did? It was unconsciously playing out its old history. It never looked at the wound. White people are so insecure. That's why they're constantly projecting onto everybody else. And that's why they went, and that's what started the whole slave trade. That's what started when they came to the New World. They came there. I remember reading it. I remember in college pulling my hair out, reading about guys that hadn't got off the boat yet from England who were taking out their muskets and shooting at the natives because they were reading from the Bible that God told them to take this land from the heathens. That was our unconscious experience. That was our ancestors' experience. The only reason that Rome fell was finally these guys come back after being mercenaries. They see what's happening with their grandmothers and their kids and their mothers, and then they say, can you just let us in, bring us food? We just want to be part of the Roman Empire. Can we just please be part of the Roman Empire? We've died and bled for you already. Can we be part of you? And they said no. And they were starving. So the soldiers rounded everybody up and said, we're leaving. And they left the concentration camps and they started trying to find somebody that would help them. They went to another big city and said, hey, you guys are supposed to feed us. And they said, no. And then they send out their army to fight against them, and these badasses slice them into pieces and go to the next town and said, hey, we're just trying to get food. You said you would let us in. We just want to be part of it. And then they send out their army, slices those guys to pieces. And they did this. They wandered all around, even into northern Africa, and then back up into Italy until finally they got to Rome. And they stood outside of Rome. And Rome was, it blocked itself off and it starved itself out. And they finally broke through and there was nothing left. That was the fall of Rome. And those Gothic warriors who were just trying to be part of the Roman Empire and had been, thrown around and treated like crap everywhere they went. When they got into Rome, there was nobody left. They just took over. That's why you have like Vince Lombardi, Langobard. That's why you have blonde-haired, blue-eyed Italians. And that's why that's what's happening today. The racism that still exists today is an unconscious genetic memory from 2,000 years ago. And what didn't happen is if those Germanic warriors had sat down and dealt with the pain and the grief, because what did they do? The first thing that they did is they adopted the Roman language, the Roman culture, Roman religion. What did the Frankish tribes do when they came in? Because then that's when everything changed. Once that happened, then it was a free-for-all. And then the Frankish tribes, which were Germanic tribes, came down into France, which was Gaul then, and it was a Roman, territory of Gaul. What did they do? They threw away their Germanic language and tried to speak tried to speak Latin. And it's every time I listen to a French person talk, I want to crack up because what I hear is just some low-class Germanic warrior trying to speak Latin because that's all it is. You write it out. They even write it out like Les Miserables. You give that to Arnold Schwarzenegger, it comes out Les Miserables. That's why they talk like that. So what I'm trying to say is that white people have thrown away their own understanding of who they are because they hate themselves. And they hate themselves because for at least 400 years, they were constantly being treated like second-class citizens. They were traded as objects. They were taken as slaves. They were the same thing that we did, meaning Americans, what we did to the Native Americans. We would conquer them and then give them a treaty. And we would sign the treaty and say, you're going to have all of this land and you got all of that and here's the treaty. And the Indians are like, okay, fine, at least they wrote a treaty. And then, a month later or a year later, they'd break that treaty. Where do you think we learned how to do that? The Romans did the same thing to our ancestors. And when they were conquering Northern Europe, they'd come in, they'd write a treaty, and we would sign the treaty, and then they'd break the treaty. We never got over that wound. So the question of what would be the ethical explanation for why racism is wrong, I don't understand why you would even ask that question. Why is it wrong to club somebody over the head? It hurts, man. What more do you need? It doesn't feel good. Nobody likes it. It makes me want to cry. I don't understand why people have to, I don't get it. Gary Rosenquist, question. Are all souls here now and why? What? Gary, you're new to the channel. It's late. You got nothing better to do. Have I said anything like that? He says, I am a starseed, light worker, or shaman. How do I know which? I don't teach any of that crap. I don't know anything about starseeds or light workers. I use the word shaman, but you're welcome to my channel and you're welcome to watch my videos and learn what I teach. I don't teach any of what you just mentioned, so I can't answer it. Renee, Battlewoman of the Woods, question. When is the next lifestyle video? I think that's a joke. She dropped down $2. Thank you. What is it that you think you're going to comment on that's going to be too stressful for me? It sounds like you're going to say something pro-racist, which is going to piss me off. You're right. You say anything that's going to be even the slightest bit racialist or racist, I'm not going to like it. Let's see. There's that strange name again. Question. If books can't help me, as I can't afford therapy at the moment, is there a meditation or spiritual way to figure out what the problem I have in my mind to remove beings for myself? So I don't know what to tell you, man. You're wanting to give me excuses on why you can't go to therapy, but you've asked to get everybody up to speed. This guy says that he has beings in his mind and he wants them removed. And I've said, you need therapy. Books aren't going to help you. You need therapy. You need to sit with somebody. And I don't know what to tell you. You can't afford it. I'm sure if you looked hard enough, you could find some way to get some some counseling somewhere. But you need counseling. You've probably got a psychological problem. It's not a spiritual problem, it's a psychological problem. There were already people, Alex says, there are already people with fair hair and eyes in the Italic Peninsula since the times of the Romans. Yeah, there is some, but that's because there would be trickles in from people from the Celtic. We're talking northern Italy. You get down into southern Italy, it's a totally different deal. In fact, you go to some of the frescoes, like, before all this, like, 2,000 years and before, you look at some of the frescoes in southern Italy, you see very dark people, very dark skin, very dark eyes, very dark hair. They used to, there was, a Germanic mercenary who, I don't know if he was a slave. I think he was a Germanic tribal guy that was taken by the Romans. Romans used to do this. They would just go into villages and take young men of fighting age. And they went in and took this guy who ended up actually being the guy who fought the Romans off when they tried to come into Germania. He was the guy that, because he had fought in the Roman Empire. And they called him Blondie. So if there were a bunch of people in Italy at that time, if there was that many people, they wouldn't have chosen to call this guy Blondie. They called him Blondie because that was unusual. Roman women used to bleach their hair blonde because they wanted to look exotic. You know how now, like, white girls, all over the place here. It bugs the crap out of me because it's just so unnatural looking. All the hippie girls here now want to put their hair into whatever you call that, into dreads, which is not natural for straight hair. You have to do really disgusting things to your hair to get it to do that. If you have hair like that naturally, you just leave it alone. It turns out. So it's like being natural. You grow your hair long. That's how they grow their hair long. If you've got that, that kind of hair. So they would do the same thing. It was the opposite though. But instead of trying to, flip your hat around and trying to act like you're a rapper, you want to be cool and exotic. Like now, white women want to look like they have, African hair. But what the Roman women used to do is they used to straighten and bleach their hair blonde because they wanted to look like the exotic German slave girl. If there was a bunch of, white people like that down there at that time, then it wouldn't be such an unusual thing. So while, yeah, if you want to, you can find some evidence of that. I'm telling you, there was a racial difference back then. And what I'm saying is that, what white people did because of the oppression that they experienced, which was different, it's not exactly the same as today, but they were oppressed because of their ethnicity and because of their language and because of their culture. They were oppressed. They were taken slaves. Because of that, because especially Germanic tribes never got over that. They never addressed it. They just ingested it and then projected it out. They overcompensated. They became better racists than the Romans were. That's what I'm trying to say. And that's what all this shit is going on, still to this day. Renee, Battle Woman of the Woods. Yes, the lifestyle of the expat. You did some nice videos. Oh, okay, whatever. I mean, thank you. That's not a question. It sounds, Renee, like you're trying to talk me out of my angry rant right now. Are my feelings making you uncomfortable? I'm getting intense and I'm talking about all this. Does it make you uncomfortable? It's okay to be uncomfortable. Remember that. You don't have to talk me out of it. It's okay. This is actually helpful for me. Anyway. All right, that's it for me. For right now, I don't see any more questions, and I've done all the ranting I'm going to do. Wish me luck. I got my new visa for the next 6 months. I can probably extend it to 9 months, They gave it to me. It expires on December 25th. How's that for timing? Oh, thanks. I get to get on a plane on December 25th. What a great idea. But I'm hoping that the border closures will come to an end and there will be no more border closures, and then I can go back to what I was doing before. But wish me luck. I'm a little sad about that. It's probably coming through in what I'm saying. Anyway, so I've ranted and babbled long enough. I'm going to go because I'm going to go to sleep and get up and go surfing tomorrow. Hope you guys are doing well. Talk to you all later.